Welcome to Bumpy Johnson Uncensored. Now let's get into the unbelievable 1935 incident where a racist doorman tried to block Bumpy Johnson from entering a whites-only club. And what happened next shook all of New York. It was a cold evening in 1935 when Bumpy Johnson stepped out of a long black Packard that had just pulled up in front of one of Harlem's most exclusive establishments. An elite whites-only social club known for its strict entry rules and even stricter racism. The sidewalk glowed under the street lamps. The jazz music inside thumped faintly through the heavy wooden doors. Wealthy businessmen in tailored suits strolled in without being questioned, laughing loudly, sipping cigars, and flaunting their sense of untouchable privilege. Bumpy wasn't there for entertainment. He was there on business, real business. His appearance was deliberate, sharp charcoal overcoat, perfectly creased slacks, polished shoes that reflected the lights like mirrors. He didn't rush, he didn't slouch. He walked with the calm confidence of a man who understood exactly who he was and how much power he carried in Harlem. As he approached the entrance, the people on the street began to instinctively slow down, watching. Even in 1935, Bumpy's presence attracted attention, some fearful, some respectful, some just plain curious. Nobody walked quite like Bumpy Johnson unless they had real influence behind them. The club itself was more than just a bar. It was a fortress of white wealth, a place where politicians, mob-connected businessmen, and high-ranking city officials gathered to drink, talk deals, and pull strings that shaped New York's future. It was understood black people were not welcome. Not as guests, not as workers, not even as delivery boys. But that night, Bumpy wasn't asking for permission. He walked straight up the marble staircase and toward the door like he owned the building. And for a moment, the crowd fell silent, realizing something unusual, maybe even historic, was about to happen, just as Bumpy reached for the brass door handle. A thick arm shot out in front of him like a steel gate. The doorman, an oversized man with a red face, a cheap cigar glued to his lips, the arrogance of someone who believed a uniform made him superior, stepped forward until he was nose to nose with Bumpy. The man's eyes narrowed, flicking Bumpy up and down with disgust, as if he couldn't believe a black man had the audacity to walk up those marble steps. He puffed his chest like he owned the place, even though all he really owned was the cheap hat sitting crooked on his head. "Hold it right there," the doorman growled, loud enough for everyone around to hear. "You people don't come in here." The insult wasn't whispered. It wasn't hidden. It was intentional, meant to humiliate Bumpy in front of the growing crowd. A few men on the sidewalk laughed nervously, unsure if they should look away or keep watching. Others froze, sensing danger, because disrespecting Bumpy Johnson in public was like striking a match in a room full of gasoline. But the doorman wasn't done. He stepped even closer, blocking the entire doorway with his body. "You think you can just stroll in here like you belong? This club ain't for your kind. Try the alley if you want to sweep up after the real guests." The crowd gasped. Even the ones who hated Bumpy knew those words were a death wish. Bumpy didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply tilted his head slightly, studying the man's face like he was examining a slow, foolish animal. There was no anger in his eyes, just a cold, unnerving calm. And that calm made the moment 10 times more dangerous. The doorman mistook Bumpy's silence for fear and barked again, louder this time, trying to prove himself to the white men smoking on the balcony above. "Turn around, boy," he spat, "before I make you." That word, boy, echoed down the street like a gunshot. People in the crowd tensed up. A woman covered her mouth. A taxi slowed down just to see what would happen next. Everyone knew if Bumpy reacted with violence, the newspapers would twist the story. If he backed down, he'd lose all respect in Harlem. The doorman didn't realize it, but he had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. And Bumpy, still silent, simply adjusted his gloves. A tiny gesture that told everyone watching something was about to happen. Something big. A crowd gathers. Tension rises as whispers spread through the street. The moment the doorman barked that last insult, the energy on the street shifted. Instantly, sharply. What started as a few curious onlookers grew into a thick semicircle of people inching closer, forming an invisible ring around the steps of the club. Harlem didn't need telephones or announcements. News traveled faster through body language, rising voices, and instinct. And right now, everyone sensed something dangerous was building. A street vendor abandoned his pushcart mid-sale just to get a better view. Shopkeepers ducked out of their doorways. Taxi drivers slowed their engines and leaned forward in their seats. Passers-by, who were originally rushing to catch the evening train, suddenly forgot their schedules completely. They all knew Bumpy Johnson. They all understood what it meant to see him being disrespected, especially in public, especially by a white doorman at a whites-only club. Whispers spread like wildfire through the growing crowd. "Eyes that Bumpy. What's that fool doorman doing? He must not know who he's talking to." This is about to get ugly. Even the white patron standing on the balcony of the club sensed something was off. Their laughter faded as they leaned over the railing to observe the scene unfolding below. Some looked amused, others uneasy. They knew Bumpy by reputation too, but they didn't always understand his methods. They expected fireworks. They expected violence. The stillness in Bumpy's posture confused them. Bumpy didn't flinch, didn't shout, didn't even raise an eyebrow. That was the most unsettling part. To the crowd, Bumpy's calm felt like the ominous silence before a thunderstorm. Everyone knew things could erupt at any second, but nobody could predict how or who was about to get hurt. The tension stretched tight, like a rope pulled to its breaking point. A few of Bumpy's own men, who had been standing discreetly across the street, noticed the escalating situation and began making their way forward. They didn't rush, they didn't draw attention. They simply drifted closer, hands in their coats, eyes fixed on the doorman, as though measuring the man's remaining lifespan. People stepped back to give Bumpy space, but they leaned forward with their eyes, not wanting to miss a single detail. Every breath seemed louder. Every movement seemed amplified. Even the wind felt like it paused to watch. At that moment, the entire block was suspended between calm and chaos. One wrong word, one sudden move, one raised fist, and Harlem would explode. The crowd held its breath, and Bumpy finally shifted his weight ever so slightly, a subtle sign that the next moment would decide everything. As the doorman continued puffing his chest like a rooster guarding an empty barn, Bumpy finally moved, not with anger, not with aggression, but with chilling precision. He slowly removed one glove and tapped it against his palm twice. That's all. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture. Just two soft taps. To anyone else, it looked like nothing. To his men, it was everything. Across the street, three of Bumpy's most trusted associates caught the signal instantly. They stopped mid-step, their eyes locking onto Bumpy's hand. No words needed. They had seen that gesture before, during negotiations, during tense standoffs, during moments where violence was a heartbeat away. That signal meant, hold your ground, but be ready. Not yet. The men formed a subtle triangle around the entrance, positioning themselves exactly where Bumpy needed them. They didn't pull weapons, didn't raise their voices. They simply stood still, watching, waiting, making it clear that Bumpy wasn't alone. The crowd noticed. The doorman didn't. He was too focused on puffing himself up, too blinded by his own prejudice to read the air around him. He didn't see the silent coordination. He didn't notice the shift in posture from the men now flanking Bumpy like shadows. He didn't understand the sudden hush that fell over the street. But everyone else did. Onlookers exchanged looks that said everything. It's starting. He just gave the signal. This man has no idea who he's dealing with. Even the white patrons on the balcony began stepping back, suddenly unsure if mocking laughter was still appropriate. Something was wrong. They could feel it, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in a single breath. Bumpy, meanwhile, kept his eyes locked on the doorman's face, studying him calmly, almost sympathetically. He was watching a man walk toward his own downfall without realizing it. He didn't raise a hand, didn't insult back, didn't even break his posture. The stillness was more intimidating than rage could ever be. The doorman, misreading that calm as weakness, smirked wider. "Yeah, that's right. You know your place." But Bumpy's men heard it. The crowd heard it. New York itself seemed to hear it. And then came the second gesture. Barely noticeable, Bumpy lifted 2 fingers at waist level, the motion so small it could be mistaken for adjusting his coat. His men straightened slightly, like soldiers receiving new orders. Their hands slipped just a little deeper into their pockets. The crowd stepped back as if pulled by gravity. Everyone knew that second signal meant something different. Prepare for the next move. And yet Bumpy still didn't raise his voice, still didn't threaten, still didn't move aggressively. His silence was no longer calm. It was a warning. The doorman was standing inches away from an explosion he couldn't see, and Bumpy, controlled, composed, was about to turn the entire situation on its head without lifting a finger. Just as the street seemed frozen in suspense, the heavy double doors of the club swung open, not with panic, but with authority. The jazz music and chatter from inside briefly spilled into the cold night air before being swallowed by silence. A tall, dressed man stepped out, wearing a tailored navy suit, a gold tie pin, and the kind of confidence that came from knowing he held real influence in both political and financial circles. This was Charles, Doc, Hannigan, one of the wealthiest black businessmen in Harlem, known for running legitimate storefronts by day and funding half the neighborhood's protection networks by night. He was a man who could talk to city officials in the afternoon and sit at a policy meeting with Harlem leaders by evening. Very few people in New York, black or white, could ignore him. The crowd instantly recognized him. Whispers rippled like a current through the air. "That's Doc Hannigan. He's inside the club. This is bigger than we thought." Paused at the top of the steps, surveying the scene with sharp, intelligent eyes. He saw the doorman blocking Bumpy, like a guard dog without a leash. He saw Bumpy's men positioned strategically. He saw the crowd holding its breath. And he immediately understood he had walked into a situation that could explode in seconds. The doorman, however, was oblivious. He didn't recognize Doc's face. He only saw skin color. "Hey!" the doorman snapped, waving his hand in Doc's direction. "You two, back inside or get lost. This door ain't for you people." The crowd gasped again. Even some of the white patrons watching from above recoiled. They knew Hannigan's connections. They knew the doorman had just stepped into a level of trouble he could never comprehend. Doc Hannigan froze for a second, not out of fear, out of calculated disbelief. He inhaled slowly, adjusting his cufflinks, a small, calm gesture that meant he was deciding exactly how much trouble this doorman was about to face. Then Doc's eyes met Bumpy's, and the tension between the two men was nothing like the tension between Bumpy and the doorman. It wasn't conflict, it was recognition, respect, and silent communication between two powerful figures who understood Harlem politics better than most city officials. Doc gave Bumpy a subtle nod, the kind only men of influence exchanged when the situation required discipline instead of chaos. Bumpy returned the nod with equal precision. The crowd noticed, the doorman didn't. Doc Hannigan took one slow step down toward Bumpy, placing himself between Bumpy and the doorman without saying a word. He didn't come out to protect the doorman. He came out to protect the bigger picture. He knew that if Bumpy reacted violently, Harlem would suffer. The newspapers would twist it. The police would weaponize it. Politicians would use it. But Doc also knew something else. If Bumpy walked away in humiliation, Harlem's respect for him would crumble. Either option was a disaster, so Doc chose a third path. He turned toward the doorman, his voice low but razor sharp. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" The doorman scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Yeah." Trouble. Doc's expression didn't change, but his tone did, now colder, heavier. "No. You're looking at the man who keeps this neighborhood safer than the police ever have. You're seconds away from making the worst mistake of your life." The crowd murmured in agreement. Bumpy's men stayed still, watching. Bumpy himself remained calm, letting Doc do the talking for now. Doc had stepped out not to escalate, but to shift the power dynamic. The doorman wasn't facing one black man anymore. He was facing Harlem itself, and for the first time, the doorman's confidence wavered, just a little. But that little shift was all Bumpy needed to begin turning the situation from humiliation into total control. The moment Doc Hannigan stepped between Bumpy and the doorman, the entire atmosphere shifted from a simple argument into a silent battle of power. It was no longer just a racist doorman blocking a black man from entering a whites only club. It had become something much bigger, a clash between two worlds trying to claim control of New York's future. On one side stood the club, an emblem of old money, old politics, and old racism. A place where wealthy white men had long called the shots, convinced their status made them untouchable. On the other side stood Bumpy Johnson and Doc Hannigan, symbols of Harlem's rising power, men who operated in a new kind of economy. Influence, alliances, respect, and silent leverage built through loyalty and necessity. The doorman, clueless to the magnitude of the moment, continued posturing. "Both of you better back off," he barked, unaware his voice trembled slightly now. "This club isn't for your kind. I'm just doing my job." Doc Hannigan turned slowly toward him, his expression unreadable, part disappointment, part warning, part calculation. "Your job," Doc said calmly, "is to open doors. But you're about to close the wrong one." The doorman laughed nervously, glancing up at the balcony for backup. A few white patrons shrugged, pretending not to know him. Others watched with cold amusement, treating the confrontation like entertainment. They wanted to see how far this would go. They wanted violence without consequences for them. Anyway, Bumpy noticed everything. He always did. His eyes swept the balcony, the street, the shadows. He wasn't just looking for threats. He was calculating influence. This wasn't about fists or guns. If he played this right, he'd walk through those doors with more power than any man inside. If he played it wrong, Harlem would pay the price. He took a single step forward. Not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to let every person watching feel his presence fill the space. The doorman put his hand on Bumpy's chest to stop him. Bad move. Crowd gasped, shocked the man had actually touched him. The white patrons leaned forward, fascinated. Even Bumpy's own men stiffened, hands dipping deeper into their coats. But Bumpy didn't react. That made it worse. Because a man who stays calm in the face of disrespect is not weak, he's confident in the damage he could unleash if he chose to. Hannigan leaned closer to the doorman, lowering his voice into a steady, controlled tone. "You think you represent this club?" he asked. "You don't. You represent ignorance. And ignorance can cost an establishment more than bullets ever will." The doorman blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" Doc didn't answer. He just stepped aside so the doorman could see what he had missed. 3 black sedans had rolled up quietly. Doors opened. More of Bumpy's men stepped out, calm, organized, silent. They weren't here to fight. They were here to send a message. Harlem had arrived, and Harlem wasn't afraid. The white club patrons on the balcony suddenly stopped smirking. The balance of power on that street began to tilt dramatically. The doorman realized he wasn't blocking one man. He was standing against an entire network of influence he couldn't map, predict, or control. Old money still had buildings, politicians, and institutions. But Harlem had unity, loyalty, and numbers. And at that moment, the old guard felt its foundation shake. The power struggle wasn't physical, it was psychological. And Bumpy Johnson hadn't even spoken a word yet. As the tension stretched thin enough to snap, Bumpy finally made his move. Not the move anyone expected. He didn't push the doorman. He didn't threaten him. He didn't shout. Instead, he did the one thing guaranteed to undermine every ounce of false authority the doorman clung to. He smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a forced one. Calm, deliberate, controlled smile, the kind of expression that said he already knew how this moment would end, and he wasn't worried in the slightest. The crowd murmured, confused, unsure whether to be relieved or even more afraid. Bumpy's smile wasn't a sign of peace, it was a sign of confidence so deep that aggression wasn't necessary. Then, without looking at the doorman, Bumpy slowly turned his head toward the balcony of watching club members. His eyes locked on one specific man, a wealthy city official, recognizable by his silver pocket watch and tailored overcoat, a man who had influence far above the doorman's pay grade. The official froze when he saw Bumpy looking up at him. Their eyes met for a few seconds that felt like minutes. Bumpy didn't need to speak. He didn't need to shout. His look said everything. "You know who I am. You know what I can do. And you know you don't want this problem." The official swallowed hard. He turned pale. He knew exactly what was at stake. He whispered urgently to another man beside him. That man immediately disappeared back inside, pushing past waiters to alert the club's management. The doorman watched this unfold, confused. He still thought he was in control. He still believed he was enforcing the club's rules. But above him, decisions were being made far beyond his understanding. Then came the final step of the flip. Bumpy calmly reached into his coat, not fast, not aggressively, and pulled out something the crowd didn't expect, a small white envelope. He held it lightly between his fingers and extended it toward the doorman, who flinched like it might be a weapon. When the doorman realized it was just paper, he sneered, refusing to take it. "You think you can bribe your way in here?" The doorman spat. Bumpy chuckled softly, just a breath of amusement, and tucked the envelope back into his pocket. "It's not a bribe," he said quietly, his voice smooth and controlled, It's an invitation. The doorman blinked, confused. Invitation? From who? Before Bumpy could answer, the club doors flew open again. This time, a distinguished white man in a tuxedo hurried out, the club manager. His face was red, not from anger. It was from fear. He rushed to the doorman, whispering harshly, "Do you know who that is?" The doorman shrugged ignorantly. "No. Should I?" The manager's voice cracked. "That's Bumpy Johnson, you idiot!" The crowd erupted with murmurs. The doorman's face drained of color. The balance of power shifted instantly. The manager straightened his jacket, forcing a smile as he approached Bumpy with a trembling hand extended. Horum stirred. "Johnson, we've been expecting you." The crowd gasped. The doorman's mouth fell open, and Bumpy, still calm, still in control, slowly placed his glove back on his hand. He didn't fight his way in. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. He let his reputation, his connections, and his composure do all the work. Without laying a finger on anyone, Bumpy had turned humiliation into domination. He walked up the steps, past the frozen doorman, and stepped into the club as if he owned the place. Because in that moment, he did. Inside the club, the atmosphere shifted the moment Bumpy crossed the threshold. Conversations that had been loud and carefree suddenly sputtered into uneasy silence. Men holding cigars froze mid-puff. Champagne glasses paused halfway to their lips. Even the jazz band, unaware of the tension, played softer, as if the air itself told them to quiet down. Everyone recognized Bumpy now, or at least they recognized what his presence meant. This wasn't just a man walking into a restricted space. This was a statement. And the club's owner, an older, heavy-set man with a silver beard and diamond cufflinks, was watching from behind a polished mahogany bar. His jaw clenched when he saw Bumpy enter, but not out of anger. Out of realization, he had miscalculated. He had assumed Bumpy Johnson was just another Harlem troublemaker. Someone easily blocked at the door. Someone whose presence wouldn't matter to the powerful men inside. When the owner noticed the city official stepping quickly down from the balcony, making a beeline for Bumpy with a worried expression, the truth hit him hard. Bumpy's influence stretched farther than he had ever imagined. The official reached Bumpy first, offering a handshake with both hands, the kind a politician gives when he's afraid of losing favor. "Mr. Johnson, I wasn't informed you were arriving tonight. My apologies." Bumpy didn't take the apology immediately. He let it hang in the air, forcing the entire room to witness the official's discomfort. Power wasn't in the handshake, it was in the hesitation. Only then did Bumpy shake the man's hand, slow and deliberate. The club owner watched this exchange with growing alarm. This wasn't a gangster. This was a man tied into political channels, business alliances, and social power across Harlem. A man whose favor could benefit the club, or whose anger could ruin it overnight. Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was an economy, a force, a culture, and Bumpy was at the center of it. The owner finally approached, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Mr. Johnson, welcome. I regret the misunderstanding at the door." Bumpy raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding," he said quietly. The owner swallowed hard. Yes, of course. Just a mistake by our staff." Bumpy turned slightly, glancing back toward the entrance where the doorman stood frozen, pale and sweating. "A mistake," Bumpy repeated. The words were soft, but the weight behind them crushed the owner's confidence. The owner nodded quickly, eager to repair the situation. "We'll handle it." Immediately, he signaled to a security supervisor who rushed toward the doorman. Within seconds, the doorman was being escorted out of the building, escorted down the steps, and humiliated, removed from his post in full view of the crowd. Everyone saw it. Everyone understood what it meant. The club wasn't removing the doorman because he was wrong. They removed him because he crossed someone they couldn't afford to anger. The owner turned back to Bumpy, voice shaking slightly. "If you need a private table, the VIP room is ready." On the house, Bumpy didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't thank him. He simply said, quietly, "I know." The entire club watched as Bumpy walked past the owner without another word, his men entering behind him in a confident, silent formation. The whispers swirled like smoke. "He knows the official. He knows the owner. He walked in like he runs the place." Maybe he does. In that moment, the club owners realized they had made a fatal misjudgment. Bumpy Johnson wasn't someone they could exclude. He was someone they needed, someone they feared, someone who had the power to expose their connections, disrupt their business, or influence their political allies. He wasn't just a Harlem figure anymore. He was a New York figure, and by trying to keep him out, they had accidentally proven how much control he truly had. Bumpy walks out hours later, leaving a message that echoes through New York. Hours passed inside that once white's only club, and by the time Bumpy Johnson finally stepped out onto the sidewalk again, the entire neighborhood felt different. The street was quieter now, but not empty. People had waited, curious, anxious, wanting to see how the night would end. When the doors opened, Bumpy didn't rush out. He strolled out calmly, coat over his arm, his steps measured and deliberate. Not a scratch on him, not a hair out of place. His men followed behind him like a silent procession, perfectly spaced, perfectly coordinated, sending a clear message to anyone watching. Bumpy hadn't just been allowed in, he had been hosted, respected, heard. The club manager followed him out with his head slightly bowed, not daring to raise his voice. The same club that had once barred black men from even stepping near the entrance was now practically escorting Bumpy out like royalty. The crowd outside watched in awe. No violence, no chaos, no shouting match, just quiet, controlled dominance. Bumpy paused at the top of the steps, scanning the street. He knew people were waiting for something, some sign of how they should interpret what happened. He didn't need to brag. He didn't need to speak loudly. The result was already clear, but he decided to leave a message anyway. He looked at the club's new temporary doorman, a younger man who stood stiff and nervous, clearly terrified of making the same mistake as the one who had been fired. Bumpy stepped close enough for the new doorman to hear, but kept his voice calm. "You treat every man with respect," he said, "because he's powerful, but because you don't know who he might be." The new doorman nodded frantically. "Yes, sir. Absolutely." "Sir." Bumpy nodded once, not in approval, but in acknowledgement that the lesson had landed. Then he turned to leave. Before he could take 3 steps down the stairs, a white club member, well dressed, wealthy, clearly embarrassed, hurried after him. "Mr. Johnson." The man called out, "Tonight changes things." Bumpy didn't turn around. "Good," he said simply. Some things needed changing. The man fell silent, unable to find a better response. Bumpy descended the stairs and walked to his car. His driver opened the back door, but Bumpy paused, giving the crowd one last look. His eyes were calm, steady, confident, letting everyone know the meaning of what had just happened. That night wasn't about getting into a club. It was about shifting power, showing Harlem that they didn't have to accept disrespect, showing the city that his influence reached far beyond the blocks they tried to confine him to. The message spread through New York like gossip wrapped in electricity. Bumpy didn't fight his way in. They let him in. They apologized. They removed their own man for disrespecting him. He walked out like he owned the place. By morning, the story had already traveled from Harlem barbershops to downtown offices, from taxi radios to political backrooms. Everyone told it differently, but the ending stayed the same. Bumpy Johnson had walked into a place built to exclude him and left it with the entire city rethinking who actually held the power.